Let's get started. Hello and welcome. This is Tomb Raider Rebooted, Audio Reimagined. My name is Jack Grillo. I was the lead sound designer for Tomb Raider. This is Alex Wilmer, music supervisor. This session is being recorded, so we're asked to ask you to please silence your cell phones. The talk will be broken up into a few discussions. I will speak about creative direction, voiceover, and sound effects. Alex will speak about music, and then we'll open it up for some questions. I'm going to start off by playing a trailer from the 2012 VGAs. It features our composer, Jason Graves, conducting a live orchestra.
So much has happened.
Our captain is injured.
Have you heard from any of the others?
Nothing.
Our crew is scattered.
I have a bad feeling about this. I've got to find them.
We're hunted by the island's inhabitants.
She's got me locked up.
Sam, listen. I'm going to get you out of there. I don't think I'm that kind of Croft.
Sure you are. You just don't know it yet.
All right, let's do this. There's no other choice. I've got to do this.
If I don't survive, none of us will.
Okay, so we're going to start with... All right, we're going to start with a bit about ourselves. I've been a sound effects designer for the past 18 years, specializing in games since 2000. Early in my career, I worked as a sound designer for a few of the early Medal of Honor titles, and as lead sound designer for Medal of Honor Allied Assault for PC. I went on to be a consultant for the first Call of Duty game for PC and audio director for Call of Duty Finest Hour. I've been with Crystal Dynamics, working as lead sound designer for the Tomb Raider series since for the last 4 years. For Tomb Raider, my responsibilities included defining the creative direction for the audio department, generating sound design elements, voiceover directing and editing, cinematics editing and mixing, assisted with general implementation, and assisted with the overall mix.
I've been in the industry for about 8 years. For 4 years, I was working at a company called Berkeley Sound Artists, where it's a audio post-production facility that mainly worked on documentary films and independent features. But there I was the director of video game audio, which is a title that I gave myself to sound fancy in the video game industry. which didn't work very well. And at Crystal, my first project was Guardian of Light, and I was then on Tomb Raider. I was the music supervisor for that. But we were a small team of 4 people. The other 2 are right there, and we all had to do a little bit of everything. But that was my main role.
So as the title of this discussion states, the recent Tomb Raider was a reboot. It was officially the 9th Tomb Raider title, but because it was the Lara Croft origin story, we had the amazing opportunity to create a new spin on the iconic Tomb Raider and Lara Croft brands. Production on Tomb Raider was the best of both worlds in terms of development models. It was a cross between the name recognition of an industry household name and a brand new IP. We had the unique opportunity as a team to look carefully at each aspect of the franchise, celebrate the conventions we wanted to keep, redefine parts we wanted to change, and to create from scratch new design elements and gameplay conventions. The Tomb Raider brand has been around for 18 years, and along with the natural cycles of development turnover comes plenty of new blood. For audio and related disciplines, new people filled several key positions, including game director, lead sound designer, music supervisor, composer, story and cinematics writer, a narrative designer, and of course our Lara Croft. This infusion of new blood was a shortcut to new ideas and fresh perspectives. At every turn, we were all challenged to bring our own creative voices to the franchise to help bring new life to the series. And again, as an expression of the best of both worlds concept, many of the other key positions in the audio chain were held by Tomb Raider veterans, including the creative director, game director, senior audio engineer, and cinematics director. This overall combination of talent created an ideal setting for creative collaboration and execution. As I stated in the introduction, one of my responsibilities was to define the creative direction for the audio department. And to be perfectly honest, I find that a standalone creative direction for sound is more academic than practical. Audio is often a supportive discipline, and because our work must blend with all other disciplines, from animation, visual effects, background art, and UI, to core gameplay design and the emotional arc of the narrative, I find that audio behaves as a kind of glue, an essential ingredient that ties everything else together. For a game like Tomb Raider, I believe the role of audio, at its best, is to help bring emotion to the narrative, excitement to the gameplay, and clarity to the controls. So instead of defining a standalone creative direction for sound, I find that it's much more productive to study the themes of the game as a whole, and from that exercise, identify the key pillars or anchors to focus on throughout the project. Tomb Raider is a story of how Lara Croft, a young, ambitious, and often naive archaeologist, becomes stranded on a mysterious island, struggles against harsh environmental conditions and hostile local forces, takes on the responsibility of the death of her crew and several of her closest friends, witnesses the corruption and greed of supranational powers, and ascends from the experience an elite survivalist and battle-tested hero. The brand campaign for Tomb Raider focused primarily on survival as the central theme, and while this concept was important to us throughout development, I didn't feel I can use it as an anchor to help with the sound design. But I did find that if we took the concept of Lara's character arc as an anchor, from naive and vulnerable to unsure, all the way to confident and deadly, we now had something solid to use to guide us through our sound design choices. I want to step back for a moment and say that using a character arc as a sound design anchor was new for me. In my past experience as a first-person shooter developer, I always used to consider the player's weapon as the primary anchor. This focus would drive most of my creative and logistical decisions, ranging from field recording all the way to the final mix. But for Tomb Raider, we had to think more broadly and ultimately found that using Lara as our anchor would yield the most exciting and dynamic mix, and would allow us to most directly support the overall creative goals for the game. So what does it mean to say that Lara Croft is a sound design anchor for Tomb Raider? Well, generally it means that the primary decisions for creating, organizing, implementing, and mixing must take into account the actions, emotions, and evolution of our lead character. This obviously includes voiceover direction, but it also extends to creating a proper mix for Lara's basic traversal and movement, dynamic sound design for combat and weaponry, and of course a musical score that focuses first and foremost on Lara's emotional state as opposed to the setting or action. Alex will get into greater detail about how we executed an emotional score, so I'll simply introduce the idea here. The music was directed to play out through the eyes of Lara, not as a backdrop of the island or its inhabitants. We used themes and instrumentation to represent these elements of the game, but they were always done as if they were filtered through Lara's expression, or Lara's experience first. Understanding the themes and settling on an anchor is the first step towards executing a creative direction. The next step is to match the sound design style with the tones and the narrative of the art direction. Tomb Raider has a serious narrative tone. The characters and events are all grounded with a sense of realism. And although the premise of the conflict has supernatural overtones, we push those aspects of the story through a filter of realism. The art direction follows the narrative tone with realistic character proportions, realistic environments, and puzzles based on simple physics as opposed to magic. All of this is easily pointed to a sound design style that can be described as realistic or authentic. We worked hard to make the world feel alive and real so that the player can more directly feel connected to the characters and the events. The game itself has many over-the-top sequences which we designed and mixed with excitement in mind, yet the overall tone of the sound design was intentionally realistic. I'm going to show a video here which focuses on how we worked on the small details and a push for realism.
The lifeboat. Where are they? They must have gone inland. Okay, take it slow.
So the most obvious way for audio production to support Lara's character arc is through the voiceover. This, of course, isn't fully in the control of the audio team to execute. It starts from the narrative arc and writing, which drive the cinematics. But from there, we can use the content of the cinematics to direct the performance of the surrounding voiceover content. We use Lara's character arc to ensure that all of the in-game voiceover and vocalizations match the specific part of her journey. In Tomb Raider, there are very few systemic or core voiceover hints. Rather, the moments of gameplay that required hints were written and recorded with those unique settings in mind. Early on in production, we recorded a large batch of generic reactions, hints, and motivations intended to be used as needed throughout production. But these lines were abandoned along the way because they never quite matched what Lara was going through in any given moment. As the game starts, for example, Lara needs to convince herself that she's capable of making a big jump, or that she can stomach skinning a deer, or that she can bring herself to kill another human being. Toward the middle of the game, these hints and motivations become more subtle, and by the end, they're totally unnecessary. And in development, even if we chose to include a hint or motivation with the same exact wording as in a different part of the game, we would record unique performances of each of these moments to best match her current state of mind. Lara's vocalizations, her breathing and effort sounds, were most often matched to her animations, which were shared files reused throughout the game. Because of this, we didn't have the technical mechanism to change these sounds as the game progresses. Instead, Carl Gallagher, our senior audio engineer, set up the system to be driven from her health, which created a micro character arc. At full health, Lara's basic movement animations were supported with subtle breathing sounds. When she becomes injured, these same animations are supported by more labored breathing and struggling effort performances. On top of this, many of the set-piece action spikes of the game featured unique jumping, landing, or climbing events. For these sequences, we made sure to add vocalizations that best matched that state of her journey, from scared and vulnerable at the beginning to confident and deadly at the end. I'm going to show another video which demonstrates Lara's state of mind early in the game, where she's scared and cold, And what we did is the first part of it has an in-game movement, and we overrode her standard breathing with trembling and panic sounds that then leads directly into the cinematic.
Looks abandoned.
Is anyone listening? Please respond.
Next, I'll show a video of Lara where she's a bit more confident. It's in the middle of the game. She's still exhausted and battle-weary, but you'll see a bit of the progression of her character.
Roth, can you hear me? Roth?
Lara, are you okay?
I'm fine.
You don't sound fine to me.
I'm fine, Roth.
Where are you, girl?
I'm in some kind of shanty town near the fortified palace.
I'm still coming down the hill. How did you get there so fast?
Long story.
I can see the town from here. Are you near that large gate?
I'm heading towards it.
It's the outsider.
Oh, shit.
There! Fire!
So I'd like to switch gears now and talk a bit about one of our other sound design challenges, the weapons. The combat system for Tomb Raider was a dramatic overhaul from previous titles. Combat became a strong standalone component of the game and provided a series of pacing spikes for the player. One of my general creative goals with weapon sound design is to make them feel authentic, powerful, and satisfying to fire. Basically, I want the player to have fun with them. I want them to enjoy the feel of each weapon, so much so that they lose track of their ammo just to open fire. For me, the approach I like to start with my design is from all the secondary actions. Bullet impacts, ricochets, shells ejecting and hitting the ground, reload events, and the various handling and movement actions tend to come first. This process allows me to have a solid context for designing and mixing the explosive fire sounds on top of it. I also like to break the implementation into several layers with limited or even zero variety per layer. I might have 5 different sounds overlapping for any given weapon fire, and I like to focus my attention on how these elements mix together in-game rather than focusing on creating a large array of asset variation. Most other sound categories need extensive asset variation, but I find that weapon sound design requires focus. I think this approach gives the weapons a more direct sound and sense of purpose. I'm going to show a quick video of a variety of our weapons in a combat scenario. So as a first-person shooter veteran, I felt that at first I'd be quite at home with the combat and weaponry sounds. But I found the biggest challenge was Lara's star weapon, the bow. Lara's bow can be used during combat, hunting, puzzle solving, and for traversal. This range of use made designing and mixing its sounds rather complicated, as it had to sound consistent, yet appropriate in all these contexts. Another complicating factor was the fact that realistic bow and arrow performances aren't typically loud or explosive, yet we wanted to give the player satisfying sound feedback during both stealth and explosive combat scenarios. All told, the bow went through countless iteration passes. It was probably the first sound design task I had when I joined the team, and it was such an important element to the overall sound design that we tweaked the sounds and mix of the bow throughout development. And to be honest, the only endpoint for working on it was shipping the game. Ultimately, the bow is made up of a handful of simple sounds: One realistic bow firing sound mixed with a few overlapping sounds of flapping rubber tubing, along with a low-end thump sweetener. These same elements are used for all the bow in all its contexts, and even for all bow upgrades, which I feel gives the bow a strong center and provides familiar feedback throughout its use. And here's a video showing off the bow used in combat and then as a traversal device.
You hold your tongue. There's an intruder! What? You afraid for that?
Now, another strong feature of the overall sound design mix for Tomb Raider is the ambient sounds, or more specifically, the weather. In our story, the island of Yamatai is home to the Japanese Sun Queen, who can control the weather, using the rain, wind, or lightning to her advantage, or as an expression of her anger or fear. With this in mind, we wanted to make use of the natural dynamics of weather sounds to give the island character and purpose. Heavy rain and wind events exist throughout the game, along with a couple of snowstorms and an array of waterfalls, rivers, streams, and the surrounding ocean. I used to joke with the team that the ambient sounds for Tomb Raider was a greatest hits compilation of white noise. These weather events created difficult mix challenges for us, as we needed to support the environment with a powerful, often over-the-top mix in order to match the creative direction, yet we still needed to carve out space in the mix for Lara. The technique we use to implement ambient sounds is based on designing a large number of standalone sounds for each weather category, individually placing these sounds in each level, and allowing the combinations of these sounds in-game to create a unique sounding environments. There are no scene or level-based ambient mixes in Tomb Raider. This gave us the added flexibility to tune every corner of every level, and it allowed us to control the mix of the various categories to suit the needs of the narrative or gameplay. For example, in our mixing system, we could use Lara's voiceover or weapon sounds to dynamically duck the volume of individual elements of the ambience, or if necessary, the entire ambience. Other benefits of this technique are added movement and spatial presence for the ambient sounds, and because our cinematics playback engine used the live ambiences in-game, transitions between cinematics and gameplay is smooth and dynamic. One more note about the ambient sounds for Tomb Raider. One of the benefits of drawing special attention to the weather events on the island left us with the opportunity to relish in the more subtle environments. Some of my favorite locations in the game are the quiet forested areas where the player learns basic traversal mechanics or how to use the bow for hunting. These are the areas of the game that I feel are truly immersive and provide much needed pacing break from the action spikes that surround them. And I'm going to show another video here that shows off some of our dynamics with the ambience. This video shows off also some of the variety of implementation techniques that we used. The sounds were attached to individual birds and the entire bird flock. Wind, background, ocean sounds were often white noise sounds, and then the individual ocean waves all combining together to make the overall soundscape. Okay, I'm going to pass this on over to Alex to now speak about music.
Okay, so, all right, so for Tomb Raider, I had, I think, quite lofty goals for the music. Just to give you some background, I used to come to the GDC in, 8 years ago or so. I started coming, and I would talk to developers here, and at the time I had a lot of opinions about music in video games, and I always felt like there was maybe a disconnect between composers and the people actually implementing the music, that those weren't the same person. And I felt like there was more emphasis put on making the music make sense as opposed to really scoring the emotional content, if that makes sense. So when I took on the responsibility on Tomb Raider, these were the goals that I had: to truly score, create a truly scored experience, score the emotion, support the character arc of Lara, create a unique identity, have highly dynamic music, and never hearing the same piece of music twice. And I think for a lot of people working in video games, they know that those are quite lofty goals. But with the exception of highly dynamic music, if you took that list and went to like a film director as a composer and said, "I want to do these things in your movie," you'd kind of get laughed out of the room. So it's a big deal for video games, and the reason why is to immerse, hypnotize, suspend disbelief, captivate, whatever that idea is. Because I think it comes from a part of the brain that isn't really associated with language. It's something that draws focus and you lose track of time, that kind of thing. So in order to achieve something like that, you need to plan it really, really well. And the way that we started was with the core themes. Jason Graves, who's our composer, is very seasoned at this kind of work. And when we started working on the themes, he delivered them first on piano, and this is Lara's theme that he delivered. And so we iterated on that for a while to work out the theme, but we only did it on piano, so you could just focus on what were the notes. Just for some sense of how we were establishing dynamics early on. This is the island theme, and yeah, this one's a little bit more dissonant. So once we established our themes, we started working on the overture, and to me, this was a sort of first for our industry. I'm not sure. There may be people who've done it before, but I'd never heard of it. We created basically an 8-minute piece of music that was essentially a guide for the rest of the score. And how this was built was by taking the story of the game, going through the story, all the major beats of the game, all the major character development moments, and then showing Jason the concept art for the game, and doing that. The benefit and creating this piece of music, the benefit of doing this was that you front load your iteration. So we could show this piece of music to our creative leads and iterate in a time when there isn't a lot of game built yet, so that you can't actually put music in the game anyway, but it allows you to get past the iteration point. So once you actually start creating the in-game assets, there's very little iteration at that point. So the next thing we did was steal an idea that Jason and I both worked on a game called Black Site Area 51. What they did was they created suites of music, and in order to basically populate their game with as much music as they could with as few minutes as possible, they created these suites, which were highly dense pieces of music. This is an example of what a suite looks like. Just for contrast, this is what scored cinematics look like. So you can see that you would get a lot of tracks to work with, and then what I would do is I would take these tracks and then create different mixes. So out of 2 minutes worth of music, I could get maybe 10 or 15 minutes worth of music for the game. Jason would always deliver a mixed version where I could listen to it and make sense of the piece. So this in this case, it sounds like this. but there's so many elements in this piece of music that if I was to listen to all the stems at one time, it would just come out as noise. So that was useful for that. The way that I could use these stems is obviously create something that almost sounds like a scored moment. So this is an example of something like that. And then the other way is to create small loops where you can do sequential scoring or layered scoring, and these are a couple of examples of that. So when you design it that way and you don't come at it from an angle of trying to reuse cinematics, you come at it from the angle of I'm going to reorganize your stems, you end up with a very large amount of music that you can lay down a base layer, because like one of the goals was at the beginning that I wanted to have unique music throughout the game. So, to give you a sense of these suites, this is a traversal suite from early on in the game. You can, generally how we worked was we would refer to the overture, and we would have Jason would draw from that. The traversal suite was, in this case, all the traversal suites were at the same tempo, and so you can see that if all the pink post-its are the different traversal suites throughout the game, and if, for example, I needed traversal music in between a post-it, I could combine elements from different suites because they were all in the same tempo. By the way, in the background, this is a color script that I had on my wall, which the art department uses to guide their palettes for the levels. But they're usually based on, they're based on the story and the emotion that is trying to be conveyed in a certain level. So it's very useful to use for music too. This is a suite from later on in the game. This is representing more of the scavengers who are the first major enemy that you face. And so Lara's perspective on them is that they're chaotic, and you can hear some of those sort of found sounds coming through in this. So the next one. This piece represents the Oni towards the end of the game. It's from a section of the game where they're the major enemy, and they have a much more deliberate measured rhythm to them. All right. So to give you a sense of scoring Traversal, the way that the process worked was that we would, first of all, create these loops out of the suites to lay down the base layer. And this is an example of one of those. So this is very early on in the game, and so we're building our orchestra with Lara's character as she kind of grows. So you can tell it's all sort of individual instruments. The next is a flute stinger. And that came from the suite. So we're creating very granular elements of music to do the scoring here. When there was a sequence that was too difficult to score using suites, I would send a video capture to Jason, and then he would score that specifically, and I'd send him what came before and what comes after, so he could he could join him. So I'm going to show you video now of the video that Jack showed earlier, but with music and talk a little bit over it.
The lifeboat. Where are they? They must have gone inland.
A flute stinger here that is 2 notes, one rising above the other. It creates an optimistic feeling when you see that lifeboat, that maybe your friends are alive.
Okay, take it slow.
As Lara approaches this log, I bring in a high tension tone. And then I hide the end of the tone under the stinger for when she slips, because the tension moment is gone.
Okay.
We have this driving percussion pushing the player forward. And another flute stinger, and this flute stinger was just a single note, so it's a little bit more trepidatious, but it reminds you, keeps your friends in your mind. So now I take away all the music, and that's a technique to make the player feel uncomfortable or uneasy. Listen to the volume of the strings as Lara gets to the edge of the wing. And there's another flute stinger, this time 2 notes descending. So what I was trying to say with the flute stingers was that by that moment of the game, you realize this place is a pretty dangerous environment for Lara, and you're hinting at the sense that maybe your friends are dead, and so essentially every piece of music that's in the game has a purpose, whether or not it is conveyed in that way or received in that right way. And just as a note to the volume of the violins going up as Lara gets across the wing, what we're trying to do there is really anticipate what the player's doing. And as much as we can do that in the game, I try to do that. This is an example of, at this point in the game, Lara has opened many doors with her climbing axe. It's a mechanic where you mash the X button, but it's a mechanic that you can break out of. At this point, though, this door divides 2 major sections of the game. The first section, percussion is used as a major element in the score. After the door, brass becomes the main element. And so I make an assumption here that the player is going to button mash their way through this door. And not stop. But as soon as the player makes contact with the door, I anticipate the music that follows. And so I'll play this for you so you get a sense of what that sounds like. Every time you try to anticipate what the player is going to do, you also have to take into account what happens when they don't do what you want them to do. So in this video, I'll show you what happens if the player doesn't actually open the door. In scoring combat, I use a number of techniques. These I'm going to show you some examples of some of the most basic techniques. This was the layer technique. So we have a low intensity loop. That sounds like this. So light combat, and then a heavy combat. So when Lara is firing her weapon, we transition into the heavy combat, and when she's in cover, basically when she's not firing her weapon, we're just going to play the low intensity loop.
That should do it. What the hell are we going to tell the enforcers? Don't worry about it. We'll say he lost it. Jumped to his den. But you shot him. Shit! Need help here!
So that's a pretty simple example of that implementation. The next is sequential. And that's similar to the traversal that we did before. Here's some of the elements of that pre-combat stinger. This is a stealth stinger if you kill the guy in the middle without the other guys noticing. And that's one of the combat loops. So just also listen for when Lara jumps the gap in the video. It goes from one combat loop to the other, and a stinger kind of helps blend that transition.
I can hold my liquor as long as you hold your tongue.
I heard they picked up some women in the roundup.
Yeah, Matthias chose one for the test.
Well, maybe she's the one. We might finally get off this rock.
Don't get excited. It always ends the same way. Some poor girl burns, then it's business as usual. Oh.
So those two techniques are very, very simple techniques. But what's interesting about how the implementation was done in Tomb Raider was that every single sequence or combat setup was uniquely scored. So you never get used to the systems. And you can use very, very simple systems like that and the player will never recognize what exactly is controlling the music. Hopefully. Most of the setups usually employed both of those techniques, having layered stuff and also being sequential. In this example, also, we're anticipating what's going to happen, and so there's a high frequency tone when Lara's standing at the wall. So the player has the opportunity to not engage in combat. So I'll play you what happens there.
This is the good stuff.
If you show up to the ceremony drunk, Father Matthias will cut your throat.
I can hold my liquor as long as you hold your tongue.
I heard they picked up some women in the roundup.
Yeah, Matthias chose one for the test. Get excited, it always ends the same way. Some poor girl burns and it's business as usual.
Man, I am sick of this damn place. I just want...
So, on Tomb Raider, about halfway through the development, it became obvious of the music. It became obvious that we needed to create a sort of found sound idea because of the art style and just because of how the music was getting into the game. It felt like we really needed to create unique sounds. So I asked Jason to maybe put in some chain link fence noises and things like that, and he came up with this, which was basically chicken wire. He owns chickens, and then he took a dustbin lid to create a plate, a resonating plate, and then basically started bowing it. So this is what that sounded like. So that was pretty cool. But the next thing he did was he found a sculptor that lived down the road from him, and who he went into his workshop and started finding all these kinds of interesting elements that he could make interesting sounds out of. This is a bucket that they welded some rods onto, and here are the rods. And they started creating out of metal pipes. They started creating these kind of chimes, which look like that, and then welding a bunch of metal so you could rattle this. This was made to look like bamboo because it was all sort of inspired by the art of the game. And because this guy's a sculptor, he ended up putting them all together like this, which just kind of blows my mind. It's even got a bow, like an actual bow. This is what the chimes sound like, and then the bowls. And those were really good elements for the Oni. They sound very established sounds, very confident, and worked well for the ancient inhabitants of the island. Then the vessel, as they called it, worked really well for the scavengers because it was extremely primitive sounding. And worked well for that kind of culture. So just for some scale, this is how big this thing is. It's huge. I'm going to show you a video. This is the opening level of the game, just to give you a sense of how the instrument was used to create a soundscape rather than music, but really sort of support the emotion of what's happening in this situation.
Get down. It is gonna hurt.
So it was really important to me personally that in the music in that section of the game really alienate the player and support the idea of a reboot. That we're redefining what Lara is, and so with the music, you're making a very, very bold statement, and you're almost pushing the player away and saying, you know, this game is not for you. To give you a sense of also the dynamic range of this instrument, this run out section, you solve a puzzle and then it starts a cave in. As you escape, you'll hear that the music is highly percussive. We had to add some elements to it, like brass and some bigger drums because of the limited palette of the instrument. But it's really the key focus. But back to what I was saying about pushing the player away, what I'm trying to do is create a dynamic between this and eventually playing Lara's theme for the first time. When you escape, we play Lara's theme. And so what I really wanted the effect of that to be was to draw the player in. You're constantly pushing them away. It's the first, maybe 20 minutes of the game, so hopefully they'll continue playing up until this point because they just bought it. When, so, because they need to experience this moment. But when they get out there and we play the theme, we play it on a piano. And so you go from an instrument that is highly alien to a lot of people, it's completely unique, they've never heard it before, to an instrument that a lot of people have a very personal experience with. And that dynamic is what I hope kind of grabs you for the rest of the game. So let's take a listen to that.
Gotta get out of here.
very much. I think we have about 4 minutes left for questions. We kind of cut that really close. Sorry. And if you have questions, if you come up to the mic, so they're recording it.
Yes. So one of the potential problems with having combat music is that the player can use that as kind of a bad guy radar to kind of know when guys are around or when they've been spotted. Yeah. What are some techniques that you use to kind of prevent to kind of maintain the sense of constant danger in the world?
Yeah, I think if you do it the way that we were doing it, where you consider each section of combat differently, and you don't rely on systems or like sort of template systems,
right?
You avoid situations like that because while you're playing through, you experience them happening, and you're like, oh, we're telegraphing to the player that combat's about to happen or whatever, and so you avoid that because you're handcrafting everything.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's kind of that's also the reason why you do it. But
yeah, it basically took a ton of iteration, and we were conscious of it as we were going through that very problem. We didn't want to telegraph too much. We wanted to keep it fresh for the player, and having that process of going over and over again and going from one sequence to the next kind of forced it out of us.
So to kind of keep the player surprised by, maybe this is how it usually works, but then sometimes it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and experiencing like one thing to the next, whenever you're working on a section, it's really it's difficult, but if you can, playing from the section that happened before, so that you know that, okay, that's kind of what I did there, so then people will expect something similar.
Cool.
Yeah, and kind of doing away with the idea of this is how it usually happens, because every time it's a new one.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Hey.
Hey, guys.
Hi.
So I loved your approach of basing the sound and music around Laura's kind of narrative arc. I was curious if you think that approach would work as well, like theoretically on a game where the main character's arc maybe isn't as well defined. Like, can you use the audio to supply parts of that character that are missing, or do you need the writing to kind of really be there for that character first for this sort of audio approach to work?
I think because using her arc was a new thing for me, I think that each game has its own thing that will emerge as the anchor to use. Like, for me in the past, using the weapon for a first-person shooter was really obvious for those games. Different games that have kind of a different narrative structure or different focus will require a different approach to what you're going to use as your pillar. It was really clear from the early creative direction for this game that the character arc was a real focus for the entire team. So it was an easy thing. And it took a while to really arrive at that, like, consciously, but it was an easy thing to really grab onto.
Okay.
And yeah, from a music perspective, I think it's the other way to think about it is like, what is the narrative that is being communicated to the player? And if it really is the player's narrative more than it is a character's narrative, if it's a first-person shooter, it's more about the player's experience. Identifying what that is, and then trying to support that emotion, coming at it from that angle, thinking more about why you're doing this as opposed to how you're going to do it, is generally my approach.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Hey guys. Hi. This is a question, I guess, more for Alex. I'm really fascinated by the creative relationship between you and Jason. It seems that from the impression that the way you're talking was that he would, for the suites, he would create an abundance of tracks for one piece, and then you would you then have the creative control to decide what would work for certain scenes and things and layers and things like that?
Yeah, basically. I think we were in a stage where both of us were kind of trying to discover what the end solution of this would be. It's when you look at something like this, you kind of go, oh yes, obviously it should be that. But there was so much kind of discovery that happened along the way that where our relationship was most of the time was in this state of, I have experience as a composer, but I'm more interested in implementation personally. For me, composition is much more of a personal thing, and I'd rather not do it for video games or movies. But for Jason, he knows a lot more about composition, and but he also knows he's worked on a ton of games, and so there was a very good middle ground that we had there, where I knew a little bit about his world, he knew about my world, and we were able to talk the same language and figure it out together. Because I think in the future, composers for video games are going to be essentially what we were as a unit. They're going to have a very good understanding of how the implementation is going to work, and they're going to be composing within the game. So I feel like that's the future for composers, but this is kind of like the hybrid model that is a step closer.
It's certainly a benefit for two people to have that back and forth, though.
Yeah, I think in any creative endeavor, if you can work back and forth with somebody, it's really good. But I feel like, when you look at movie composers now, there's a very clear understanding of that they're really supporting the emotion. And, somebody like Ennio Morricone, for example, I feel like a lot of his work is kind of like he's got a piece of music that he's putting in the movie, and it's almost like old, the old video game style. And I think he's like one of the best composers. I'm not saying he's bad, but it's like it's a older style of doing it. And so, I think maybe he'd be relying more on directors to kind of tell him exactly what he wants or what they want, as opposed to a lot of film composers now instinctively knowing, how something should be. So
great. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Nope. Thank you very much.
Thanks.